I love it. I got a quick question for you guys before we dive into our anchor text for today. What do you do when you know what you ought to do, but you can't do what you know you ought to do no matter how hard you try to do what you know that you ought to do? One more time. For those of you who are home still getting your popcorn bowl filled up, what do you do when you know what you ought to do, but you can't do what you know you ought to do no matter how hard you try to do what you know you ought to do because you are far too scared to do what you know that you ought to do? What do you do? All right, what do you do, fam? What do you do, to put it a different way, when you are so scared or too terrified to commit to your convictions? All right, what do you do when you're too scared to put your money where your mouth is, so to speak? What do you do when your heart is leading you one way and it feels like your mind is leading you in a completely different direction? Case in point, if I ask for a show of in the room right now, I bet everybody and their mom in here would say, yes, Pastor Sammy, I agree with Jesus and all of the research that says that living a life of extravagant generosity is so much better than the alternative, because living a life of extravagant generosity not only makes my life better, but it makes the world better, and I agree with that. All of us would agree with that, and yet, here's the crazy thing. So much of the research and numbers show that when it's all said and done, very few of us are actually willing to do what it takes to live a life marked by extraordinary and extravagant generosity, not because we don't want to, right? I think for a lot of us in here, the challenge is that we are too terrified, if we're honest, to do what it requires to live a life of generosity. The idea of opening our hands is a really, really scary thought. It's a little bit like what happened with my wife and I years and years and years ago. I spoke at a youth retreat, and after I spoke, the guys who did the youth retreat invited us to go on a ropes course with the students. And I don't know why we said yes. I think we were still at that stage where we were young enough and foolish enough to think we could still do stuff that all the young people do. Anybody know what I'm talking about, right? You know, before you realize that you were getting old. And so we said yes. And so we go to this ropes course. And I don't know, it's probably the only ropes course I've ever done in my life. So I don't know if they are all like this. But apparently this ropes course that we were doing was designed in such a way that once you do the whole ropes course, the only way to get down, right, is to basically just jump down this 30-foot ledge down the zip line. Anybody ever done one of these? Right, that's the only way to come down, okay? And I kid you not, we do this ropes course, okay? And my wife's like one of the bravest people that I know. I mean, she does things that I'm like, I don't even know how in the world you pull that off. But I'm telling you, I'm not embellishing the story when I say that we get up there, right? And my wife was so terrified of jumping down that ledge that her entire body shot down, and the only thing that was moving for 25 minutes were our eyes. Like, I'm serious. Like, you ever been that scared? Right? You ever been in a situation where your entire body, like, you guys think I'm exaggerating. She's right there. You can ask her. She'll tell you. Your entire body completely shuts down and there's nothing you can do about it. You ever been in a situation where the voice of fear is so loud you cannot hear what your husband, the ropes instructor course person, and all 80 teenagers behind you are yelling the whole time? And they were. Like, they were cheering. Like, she was there for like 2 minutes at first, you know, and I was doing the thing, and it wasn't working, and the ropes guy's doing the thing, and it wasn't working, and we got 80 kids back hanging on ropes courses, and they're like, Ashley, you can do it, yeah! 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 10, 9, 8. Dude, you guys are laughing. We were talking about this the other day, and we were dying. I think that is one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life, because it is the first time I have ever seen a group of high-strung teenagers run out of steam cheering for somebody. Like, see, do you guys know how unnatural and rare it is for teenagers to run out of steam, to go from, you can do it, screaming at the top of their lungs, to, I don't think she's gonna do it. Like everybody, like literally they were yelling and screaming and it didn't work. And the thing just torpedoed right into the ground. I asked my wife the other day, I'm like, can I please share that story? And she said yes. And I was so happy she said yes. Because I think at the end of the day, that picture of my wife sitting up on the ledge, and she was sitting, right, just body shut down, eyes the only thing moving, can't hear anything else anybody else is saying, because she's like, I do not think I can go off this 34th ledge. I think that picture is such a great snapshot for how a lot of us in the room, if we're honest, feel about this call to live extravagantly generous lives. Right, I think the truth, and I don't mean to undermine how nuanced this conversation is, but I think for a lot of us, if we're honest, it doesn't really matter what I say today, and it doesn't really matter what Jesus or the Bible has to say about generosity. It's kind of like all the people who are yelling. It doesn't really matter because we are just so terrified to do what a life of generosity requires us to do. And this is a side note to those of you, maybe you're just checking out church for the first time. In case you haven't noticed about your church friends, we talk a really, really good game about how much we trust and believe in God, and we just sang about it. But truth be told, a lot of times we are scared of doing the things that God has called us to do. The same way that a lot of the people in the Bible were scared to do what God called them to do. I want to tell you guys a story this morning about a group of people who God called to do something extraordinary, and they couldn't do it no matter how hard they tried because they were terrified. And spoiler alert, in case you need to dip out early, the big idea today is that there is not a way around the fear that a lot of us feel. And I know this conversation is a little bit bigger than generosity, but looking at it in the scope of the conversation we've been having, there's not a way around the fear, but the good news is there's a way through it. And I know that's so much easier said than done. You're like, okay, that's a nice little pastoral cliche you just kind of threw out there. But as we're about to find out, I think going through our fear is a lot more practical than a lot of us have made it out to be. So if you are in a place right now where you're just struggling with fear and you're like, I know what I ought to do and what God's calling me to do, and I'm just terrified, I don't know if I can do it, I hope you find some hope in this story. Let me give you a little bit of context. We're going to be in the book of Deuteronomy. Anybody reading Deuteronomy lately? Anybody? Yep. Yeah, that's what I thought. Nobody. It's the crisp part of your Bible that look like you haven't been in a long time. There's no markings. There's no highlights, anything. It's the 5th book in the Bible. Let me give you a little bit of a context before we dive in. So God had rescued his people, right? 400 years of slavery where? Anybody know? In Egypt, right? That took a little longer than it should have taken. But I'm going to give you a pass because it's the 9 o'clock service, right? Some of you didn't have your coffee yet, right? So God rescues them, and God makes them a promise. God says to them, hey, I'm going to take you to a land that is flowing with milk and honey. He told them that he was going to take them to a place called the Promised Land. And so they travel in the desert for a really long time. They get to the Promised Land. And when they get to the Promised Land, this is so important, okay, to the context. Moses sends some spies to go check out the land, right? So he elects 12 guys and it's like, okay, why don't you guys just kind of, sneak around and be ninjas and go see what the land is like. Is it what God told us it was? And so the 12 spies go into the land. The 12 spies come back with a report. And when they came back, they had to give a PowerPoint presentation to all of, the children of Israel of what they saw. And what do you know? Their PowerPoint presentation went from, I just imagine them standing up there with their cell phones doing the slide thing. And it went from, yes, the land is what God said. It is flowing with milk and honey. And everyone's like, yay. But there are giants in the land. And everyone's like, boo. Right? I mean, can you imagine getting that kind of report? You've been traveling for years, and this is the land that God promised you, and you're so close. And they came back, and they're like, it's exactly what God said it was going to be. The only problem is that we got giants in the land. I don't know how you would have responded, but I want you to pay attention to how the children of Israel responded when they heard reports of the giants. Deuteronomy chapter 1. Again, it's the 5th book in the Bible if you're still trying to find it. We're going to start in, verse 27 sounds about right. It says this. Here's what they said. Here's what happened when they heard. It says that they grumbled, Right? Well, let's start in verse 36. My bad. It says, but you, referring to the nation of Israel, this is Moses talking, you were unwilling to go up to the place that God promised them. It says, you rebelled against the command of the Lord your God. Now, I want you to listen to verse 27. It says, you grumbled in your tents. All right? You grumbled in your tents. If you have a Bible with you, circle the word in your tents. Real quick, as a side note, I love that it says that because it shows us, it reminds us that the disparity that we often experience in the public and the private place has been happening for centuries. And here's what I mean. You guys ever notice how when we come into a place like this, like you feel so good about your faith? Anybody else was singing the song and it's like, yay, God's amazing. There's nobody like him. I can do anything through Christ, you know, and you're just feeling so good about your faith. And then you get in your car and you go home and your kid doesn't nap. And you're like, is there even a God? And if there is, he must not care about me, right? I mean, we're laughing because it's true, right? You guys notice how quickly we go from like public praise and feeling good, and then we get into our tent and we get in the private place and things get hard, and what do we start doing? We start complaining. Anybody with me on that? Okay, I'm the only one. Thank you. One other person, 3. Thank you, Courtney, in the back, right? I mean, this is me raising my hand. Okay, this is me telling you that, and I know that it's easy when we read stories like this. If you've been in our church in a while, it's easy to just roll your eyes and be like, oh man, how could they grumble? But I'm going, this is one time where I'm not gonna roll my eyes. I'm not gonna roll my eyes because I've been there. Right? I can't tell you guys how many times I've begged God for something, and then he gives it to me, and then things get hard, and I'm like, why would you do that to me? Anybody ever been there? I'm like, come on, God, grow our church. Like, dang it, we got to do 2 services. I got to preach twice. I'm so tired. Do you even care about me? Right? Lord, just bless us with children. I have not slept in 6 months. What is happening? Right? Fam, they were in slavery for 400 years. They're like, God, save us. God saves them, takes them to the promised land. Things get hard, and guess what they say? This is amazing. They said, the Lord hates us. Isn't that great? I don't know when, but I wrote in my Bible a long time ago. I wrote, well, that escalated quickly. LOL. I mean, just think about it. They get to the promised land. It's everything God said. They're like, there are giants in the land. They're like, obviously, God hates us. Not only does God hate us, but listen to what they said. They say he brought us out of Egypt. Do you guys know Prince of Egypt? How God set them free, you know, opened the sea and all the plagues and all the miracles. Well, apparently the only reason God did that is because he wanted to deliver them into the hands of the Amorites to destroy them. Isn't that crazy? They're like, well, it's clear now. Obviously, he hates us, and he took us through all of that trouble just so we could die here. He must love the Amorites, right? I went through all that trouble just so he could deliver us into their hands. And they go on and they say this in verse 28. They say, where are we going to go? Say, our brothers have made our hearts melt in fear. They say the people are stronger and taller than we are. The cities are large with walls up to the sky. We even saw the Anakites there. All right, I was reading this the other day, and it felt like, you know that scene from The Lion King when I think the hyenas were talking and the Mufasa. Anybody remember that? Like his name makes us shudder. Exactly. Say it again, Mufasa. Mufasa, Mufasa. And they're like, I mean that's this scene, except they're not laughing. Right? They hear the name of the Anakites, and they are, I mean, literally, it says right there, it says that they have made our hearts melt in fear. And I love how this just keeps getting blown up. Listen again to what it says in verse 28. The people, not only are they stronger than us, but they're taller than us. Their cities are large, and the walls, they're up to the sky. Now, obviously, this is not their best moment. But I just want to call a timeout real quick and just give them props for being honest. I know it's easy to read these stories and go, these guys obviously don't get it. But can we just give them a little credit for saying the unspoken part out loud? Which is that the reason that they don't want to go into the land God has given them is because they are afraid. Now, here's where things get interesting. All right? So these guys are terrified. And I want you to listen to how Big Mo responds to their fear, right? If you don't know, Moses is the guy God called to lead them. Who else would I be referring to? I didn't even think about that. You guys are like, Big Mo, who is that? I didn't know there was a Big Mo in the Bible. Moses, okay, big bushy beard. You know, let my people go, Charlton Heston, any old school people. Okay, listen. Listen to how Moses responds. This is awesome. He says in verse 29, then I said to you, do not be terrified and don't be afraid of them. Don't you love that? Anybody? Don't you just love when you're afraid and someone's like, don't be afraid. And you're like, thanks. That's very helpful. Seriously, isn't that the best? Like, you ever been anxious and you're freaking out? And someone's like, stop freaking out. And you're like, thanks, that is very helpful. You know, it didn't occur to me I've been like anxious and fearful for like 15 years. If only somebody would have just told me not to be fearful, then I would not have wasted the last 15 years. It's like a switch, you know, thank you very much. Isn't that great when people do that? They're like, don't be afraid. You're like, yeah, thanks, that's not helpful. So they're freaking out, and Moses is like, hey, don't be terrified. Don't be afraid. Now, here's the good news, is that Moses doesn't stop there, right? This isn't just like some random cliche thing he's throwing up there. They are terrified. They are scared, like a lot of us in here are scared for different things. And he says, hey. He's like, hey, don't be terrified. Don't be afraid. And they're probably rolling their eyes going, thanks. That didn't occur to us at all. But then he kept going, and listen to what else he says next. He says, don't be afraid. Don't be terrified. He says in verse 30, he says, the Lord your God, who is going before you, will fight for you as he did for you in Egypt, before your very eyes and in this wilderness. There, he says, you saw how the Lord your God carried you as a father carries his son all the way you went until you reach this place. If you're in the room today and you're struggling with any kind of fear and anxiety, and I know this conversation is about generosity, but I feel like it's a lot bigger than that. If that's you, if there's something that's been keeping you up at night and you're like, man, I just feel anxious anytime I think about it, I'm just kind of freaking out and I'm kind of terrified. If that is you, I would love to prescribe for you today 3 antidotes to the fear that you are experiencing based on this text. And the way I want to do it, if you guys don't mind this morning, is I want to frame it in the form of 3 questions. Right? And the hope and the idea here is that the next time, and maybe some of you are in it right now, but the next time that you are experiencing fear, the next time that you find yourself in a situation where you're freaking out and you don't know what to do, I want you to just take a time out and ask yourself these 3 questions. And the hope is that in asking yourself these 3 questions, I believe that God will give you the faith, not to go around your fear, but to go through it. Does that make sense? 3 questions to ask in the midst of our fear out of this text. And here's the first question that I think a lot of us ought to ask ourselves if we're experiencing fear about what God has called us to do. The first question is this: whose report am I listening to? So anytime you find yourself in a situation where you're freaking out, I think one of the best things that you can do, write this down, take a picture of it, is to just take a time out and just say, hey, whose report have I been listening to? I don't know if you guys caught it or not, but did anybody catch why they were afraid? Why were they afraid? Because of the report of their, let's go back, verse 28, right? Listen to what it says in verse 28. It says this, here, listen to how they told you what was scaring them out. They said, where can we go? They said, our brothers have made our hearts melt in fear. They say, the people are stronger and taller than we are. The cities are large, with walls up to the sky. We even saw the Anakites there. Our brothers, they said, are the ones that have made our hearts melt in fear. Let me give you a little bit more to the context I gave you earlier. So you remember when I said that they got to the promised land and Moses sent 12 spies to go spy out the land? Well, I didn't mention this earlier, but when those 12 spies came back, as we're about to see, 10 of them came back with a bad report. 2 came back with a good report. I'll let you take a wild guess at whose report they believed. Right? 10 guys came back and they're like, it's not good. 2 came back and said, it's exactly what God said it was going to be. We're good to go. Check out how they responded. Go with me real quick to Numbers. We can't read the whole thing, but this is actually one of my favorite passages in the whole Bible. So please read it when you get back. Numbers is just one book over from Deuteronomy. But listen to Numbers chapter 13 and listen to what I just want to read you just a little bit of what happened. We're going to start in verse 30. It says, then Caleb, right? Now, Caleb is one of the two guys. Anybody know who the other person was? Caleb and Joshua, right? So 12 leaders go check out the land. Caleb is one of the two guys who came back with a good report. And so it says that Caleb silenced the people before Moses. And here's what Caleb said. Caleb said this. He says, hey, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. 16 words. I counted. Only once, so if I'm wrong, let me know. Fact check me after service. I can correct it for second service. But I'm pretty sure it's 16 words. Okay? You guys get the picture? They're at the promised land. They're about to go in. They come back with a report. Caleb picks up the mic and gets up there, and he's like, let me tell you about what I saw. And all he could get out was 16 words before they muted his mic. 16 words, and they're like, turn their mic off. Listen to what happens. He said that, and he says, verse 31, but the men who gone up with him. So he got 16 words out, and they like shut his mic up. They're like, oh, whoa, 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 whoa. He says, but the other men, the other 10 who went up with him, and here's what they said. We can't attack these people. They're stronger than we are. Now listen to what it says after that. It says this. It says, and they spread among the Israelites a really bad report about the land they had explored. They said, the land we explored devours those who live in it, and all the people who saw there are of great size. Notice the words that it used. They spread a bad report. I was reading this and thinking about how, fear, if you really think about it, it's like chicken pox. Right? Fear is so contagious, and it spreads fast with close contact. You guys ever notice that? Right? That's how fear works. I was going to say it's like COVID, but I think that's too soon to joke about Aunt Rona, right? Yeah, okay, too soon. All right, good. I was going to do it in second service, but not anymore after that reaction. But that's where fear is, right? Fear spreads so fast. And so 2 guys have a good report. 10 guys are freaking out. And all of a sudden, they spread a bad report. And I want you guys to listen to what happens as a result of their bad report. Listen to what happened. It says they spread a bad report. And then listen to what happens in verse 33. It says, we saw the Nephilim there. We seem like grasshoppers in our eyes, and we look the same. They're just freaking out. They're like, this is not good. And this is so sobering. Chapter 14, verse 1. It says, that night, after the bad report, all the members of the community raised their voices and they wept. Okay, fam, we're not talking a couple hundred people here. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people. And it says that they raised their voices and they wept out loud. And then it says this in verse 2. It says, all the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron and the whole assembly. And they said this. They said, if only, this is insane. They said, if only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it have been better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to each other, can you imagine being there after everything they'd been through? We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. If you're wondering what it is that happened that caused hundreds of thousands of people who had been enslaved for 400 years under a tyrant who threw their babies in the river. Like Pharaoh took their babies, threw them in the river, and they're going, we need to go back to that. If you're wondering what happened is really simple. What happened is 10 people spread a bad report. Is that crazy to anybody else in here? 10 out of hundreds of 10 people spread a bad report, and all of a sudden these cats were like, we are better off in Egypt. Now the Bible doesn't tell us how they spread the report, so I don't know if they just played a long game of telephone, or maybe they had a big massive text thread, or they went on Twitter or Facebook or whatever it is they did. Here's what I know, though, is true for a lot of us in here. The truth for a lot of us in here is the reason a lot of the times that we are living in fear and terror of what God has called us to be is because we have been listening to far too many bad reports from Facebook and Twitter and CNN and Fox and talk radio. And I have nothing against all of those mediums. I got a Facebook account. I got a Twitter account. I go on there every once in a while. There's nothing wrong with it in and of themselves. But for better or worse, I'm going to be the pastor in your life to tell you that for some of you in here, the best thing that you can do to overcome the fear that you are experiencing is to delete the app or go on a fast from news for 60 days. Can we just say that? Right? I mean, I love it that we fast from food and all these other things, but I just had a feeling that maybe for some of us in here, you're like, I just need to fast from all of the bad reports that I've been ingesting into my soul. Okay, it may not be, I don't know, what you wanted to hear, but it may be what you need to hear. That you got to turn it off. Turn it off, right? I mean, and we wonder, think about it. Just think about it for a second, right? We do the same thing. We listen to reports that aren't from God's word. We listen to reports that aren't from things that are godly, that aren't from people who are going in the same place that we're going, and we wonder why we're filled with so much fear and anxiety. Right? And then we show up on Sunday and we're like, oh man, I hope Pastor has a word for me, man. I hope there's a miracle. I hope that someone comes up and prays for me and some crazy miraculous thing happens and God transforms my life. Well, is it possible that God's saying what you need is not prayer or a word from your pastor? What you need is to turn off the radio and shut off the news and say, I'm not going to keep ingesting in my soul reports that are going to lead me to live in fear. Right? Can we just say sometimes it's that simple? To just say, I'm gonna just turn it off. Years ago, I've shared this before. I had to unfollow like 30 accounts on my Instagram. Good accounts. Because I realized every time I see those accounts, it stirs something up that's not good inside of me. And I'm like, God, will you change me? And God's like, no, you need to turn that off. You need to put yourself in a position where you're not conforming to the pattern of this world. You guys remember what Paul says in Romans chapter 12? Paul says this. He says, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world. I don't know if you've ever connected the dots, but when you ingest all of that stuff in your mind, you are conforming to the pattern of the world. But Paul says this. He says, be transformed. How? By the renewing of your mind. I know this is the part of the sermon where everybody rolls their eyes because, okay, pastor, this is like your parents telling you to eat your vegetables. But come on now, how many of you guys know that there's a different report out there? There's a different report. And it just blows my mind that there are people who will say, I am a follower of Jesus Christ. I'm a child of God. I believe that God sent Jesus 2,000 years ago. He died for my sins. He's going to come back and he's going to redeem me and redeem the whole world. And I believe that everything Jesus said is true. It blows my mind that there are people who say that. And yet, we spent 100 more times listening to the report of the enemy than this. Fam, I don't want you to read the Bible because you get extra credit. You don't get extra credit. God already loves you as much as He's going to love you. But come on now, there's a different report than the one you've been listening to that's leading to anxiety and fear. And this report is good. This report is full of life. This report is full of hope. This report guarantees your future. And so at some point, you and I have got to decide, whose report am I listening to? Show me a man or a woman in today's culture who is overcome with fear, and I'll show you a man or a woman who's probably been listening to more bad reports than they need to be listening to. And if I could take it a step further, it's not just the news and Twitter and all these things that we spend hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours ingesting in our minds. Sometimes it's people. Okay, and maybe you've never heard this before. I'm going to be the pastor that gives you permission to have boundaries with people in your life. You get to love everybody, but you don't get to be in every toxic relationship in the name of love. And there are people, you know what I'm talking about, in your life. You ever notice how you hang out with certain people and you leave and you're more anxious and you're more fearful and you're more insecure than you were before you walked in that room, because all they want to talk about is how bad it is and it's coming down and it's crashing and it's on fire, and you wonder why you're filled with so much anxiety. And God's saying, I want you to love them, but it might be time for you to turn down the volume on the bad report. Those of us who are parents in the room know this, right? If your kid came up to you every day after school and they're like, every time I sit at that lunch table with those people, I leave, I feel more insecure, I feel more fearful, I feel like the whole world's, you would be like, dude, sit at a different table, right? Find new friends. Whose report are you listening to? If you're afraid, whose report? Or how much have you been listening to the report of the Lord? And what I love about this report, just in case some of you are in here, you're like, okay, Bible, man, whatever. Look, I love that the Bible is honest. I love that the Bible doesn't hide anything. I love that Jesus said, in this world, you will have trouble. Do you know he said that? He's like, you're going to have trouble. And I would be like, wait, isn't that why you came, to take all the trouble away? He's like, no, I came for a bigger purpose. You're going to have trouble. But then listen to what he says. He says, but fear not, for I have what? Overcome the world. That's the report of the Lord. That's the report of the Lord. Paul says, man, we have been slaughtered all day like sheep without slaughter. You're like, that's not good. He's like, yeah, but in all these things we're more than conquerors, and nothing will ever separate us from the love of God. That's the report of the Lord. So if you're living in fear, whose report are you listening to? Turn the dial down on the bad report. How about we turn the mic on Caleb and Joshua? How about we turn the mic on the good reports? Right? So many of us are in here, you don't even know what God has to say about your future. Like, we're freaking out about things that God has already assured us. Whose report are you listening to? I'm getting too excited. Let me go to the next one, because we got a second service coming up. 2 questions to ask. Question number 1, man, whose report are you listening to? Question number 2 in Deuteronomy is, do you remember what the Lord has done for me, for you? And we've talked a lot about this, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. But when you find yourself in fear, ask yourself first, whose report am I listening to? And ask yourself, man, do I remember what God's done? Right? Did I save the receipts from the faithfulness of God? If you've been here a while, you're probably sick and tired of me hearing this, but I'm telling you, nothing builds your faith more than saved receipts from God's faithfulness. So if you're trying to find a way to go through the fear into what God's calling you to do, all you got to do most of the time is look in your rearview mirror at the faithfulness and the receipts of what God has done. Notice how quickly Moses is trying to draw their attention to what God has done. Let's go back to the text again. Listen to what he says. He says, don't be afraid, don't be terrified. And then he says this in verse 30. This is amazing. He says, the Lord your God who is going before you, he will fight for you. Question. How did Moses know he was going to fight for them, right? If I was there, I'd be like, okay, that's nice of you to say, Mr. Moses guy, you saw God on the mountain. That's great. I'm just sitting down here in my tent. How do I know God's going to fight for me? And Moses is like, great question, glad you asked. Here's how you know he's fighting for you, all right? As he did in Egypt, before your very eyes, and in the wilderness. There, he says, you saw how the Lord your God carried you as a father carries his son all the way you went until you reached. Do you guys see what Moses is doing here? You see how he's trying to draw their attention? He's trying to expand their perspective, because this is what fear does to us, right? This is why a lot of us are freaking out, is because fear just wants us to see what's right in our face, and we just can't see beyond that. And so we're freaking out. We're going, this is not good. I see giants. And Moses is trying to expand their perspective. Moses is like, take the blinders off. He's like, hey, you gotta look beyond that. Look what God has done. Like, do you forget? Right? He's going to fight for you because he already did. He fought for you in Egypt. He fought for you in the wilderness, and he carried you here. Have you forgotten what God has done? I don't know what you guys think of when you hear like Moses say that God carried you and God fought for you, but I want to read you something that I heard years and years ago at a youth camp, and I hope this blows your mind. But there was a quartermaster general of the U.S., I believe, a long time ago. I couldn't find it online to verify this, but I had the notes in my journal. And here's what he said about what God did for the Israelites. Just think about this for a second. He said this. You know how we said God split the sea? and they walked across it? He said this. He says, based on how many people at that time that we estimate crossed the Red Sea. He says, when they crossed the Red Sea, if the opening was so small that only two people could walk side by side, which is a funny image, by the way. Can you imagine? It's like just two people just going like this. Oh, hi, fish. You know, that's weird. He's like, if that's what happened, the line would have stretched 800 miles, and it would have taken them 35 days and nights to cross. That's a long time. But based on how long the Bible says it took them to cross, it says the opening would have to have been at least 3 miles wide. Yeah. God split the sea. It wasn't like a little dinky thing. You know, I used to think like a little gutter, and they're like, all right, hey, we're there. That was fun. No. It had to have at least 3 miles wide so that 5,000 people could have walked side by side and crossed over in one day and night. That's how big it was. He goes on to say this. He says, when they crossed into the desert, they would have needed 4,000 tons of wood each day for cooking. That's 2 freight trains, each 1 mile long. Every time this nation camped, the campground would have been 2/3 the size of Rhode Island. They would have needed 750 square miles to camp, right? And God had a pillar, by the way, of cloud and fire that was guiding them. How's that for a GPS? Right? You know, you punch in your phone and it's like, turn right now, recalculating. They had fire and clouds guiding them, and they stopped, and everybody stopped. And then he went on and said this. He said this is amazing. He said they would have needed 11 million gallons of water every day. 6 zeros. Is that a million? Is that 6 zeros? Is that right? Okay. All right. Perfect. Just wanted to make sure. That would be a freight train of tanker cars, each stretching 1,800 miles long. This one blows my mind. They would have needed 4,000 tons. They would have needed 1,500 tons of food each day. That would be equal to 2 freight trains, each a mile long, filled with food. Anybody remember how God fed them in the desert? Manna. Birds brought them tiny little tacos from heaven. And I used to just think of that as a kid, like, oh, they just got the little appetizer thing. They must have been really hungry. No, they had enough to eat. And this guy is saying, with the amount of people God fed, it would have to be 2 freight trains, each a mile long, filled with food. Every day. That's the scope of the miracle that they saw. Every day in the desert. And the moment things got hard, they're like, God hates us. Obviously brought us out here to die. Now, I know what some of you guys are thinking. You're thinking, oh, man, that's crazy, man. If I saw that, God, can God just show me, like, if I had one bird bring me a taco today, I would never doubt God the rest of my life. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know if you would have been Joshua or Caleb, or if you would have been the 10, if you saw the miracles that they saw. But here's what I do know is true about a lot of us in the room, myself included. I know for a fact that God has done things in your life that if I gave you the mic and came up here and you shared it, everybody's in here, jaws will hit the ground. I know that if we could see a behind-the-scenes footage of God's faithfulness in your life and how he got you to this moment, we would all go, why would you ever be afraid of God? Why would you ever be afraid that God, why would you ever think you couldn't trust God? All right, some of you in here, you weren't even supposed to be in this room. You didn't think you were going to make it. You lost hope for you. And Jesus met you, and he pulled you out of the pit, and he put your foot on solid ground. Some of you made those choices. You chose things, and there were consequences beyond anything you could ever imagine. You dug your own hole. You dug your own grave, and somehow God took you, and God rescued you, and God blessed you, and God brought you all the way to this point. And so the next time you're afraid, maybe just pause and just look around you and go, it is insane that I am here right now. Maybe just check the receipts. Pull out your wallet. Pull that little kid that's been keeping you up all night and go, I remember when I was sobbing and begging God for this gift. Oh my God, literally, what a miracle and a reminder of the faithfulness of God. You are surrounded by receipts of God's faithfulness. And so when you find yourself, when I find myself in a place of fear, God is saying, I want you to not only look at what reports you're listening to, but I want you to ask yourself, do I remember what the Lord has done? They freaked out because they heard a bad report. And they already forgot the God who sent them freight trains of food from the sky every day for 40 years. Every day they saw a miracle. And they forgot. And Moses is going, remember what he did. If he did that then, he's going to do it now. And what's awesome about us today is we not only have stories of God's faithfulness in our lives, but you know what else we have? We have stories of God's faithfulness. Right? These guys didn't have this. Right? Moses wasn't like, you should go read about Esther. You should go read about David, man, how God came through for Joseph. We have not only stories of God's faithfulness in our lives, but we have stories of God's faithfulness all through history. So if you're afraid, check the report you're listening to, and maybe take a minute to remember how faithful God has been. And here's the last question, and this may be the hardest one for us. And it is this: if you are afraid, will you obey anyways, even though you're afraid? Because here's the deal, and you may not like this, but here's the deal, right? A lot of us, okay, that sounds great. Okay, so if I do those two things, then I'm not going to be afraid anymore. And sometimes that's the case, but a lot of times that's not the case. And so at some point, you and I are going to have to come to a place where we ask ourselves, like these guys have to ask themselves, if I am in this place and I have remembered what God has done and I'm listening to the good reports, okay, what am I going to do now? Am I going to believe and am I going to obey what God is calling me to do in spite of the fear that I am feeling right now? You know what was so interesting about that picture I saw that with my wife kind of sitting on the ledge, where she's sitting there and she's terrified? The reason that whole thing was so funny is because there was no other way, right? There's no back door. Like, okay, you don't want to jump? Okay, this has been taking a long time. Let's go through the back door. Like the only way down was down. And she did do it, by the way, which is funny because nobody actually noticed when she did it because they had been cheering so long, they gave up. Like, seriously, like nobody actually cheered because no one was paying attention anymore. But the point is, she had to jump. And I just wonder, for some of us in here, maybe, I don't know, we've been waiting on God to take that fear away. We've been waiting on God to kind of give us this courage and to not be afraid. And I don't know, is it possible that God's saying, actually, I'm the one that's waiting on you to jump? Maybe that's the point. Right? Listen to what Moses says afterwards. John, if you could throw that up there. I don't have my Bible with me. But Moses says this, and then he says this, and he says, in spite of this, so after reminding them of what God has done, he says, in spite of this, you still did not trust in the Lord your God. How sobering is that? He's like, he split the sea. He rained down food. He gave you water out of a rock, and you still didn't trust him. Now, don't miss this. When he says trust here, he's not talking about some feeling in our heart. Because a lot of us think of trust like that. We're like, we just want this feeling of trust. Like, I just trust the Lord. And there's probably a place and a time for that feeling. But the trust, I believe, that Moses is referring to in this narrative is the kind of trust that's going to act and obey in spite of my fear. Right? The kind of trust he's talking about is the kind that's like, I'm going to jump off this ledge. And I'm going to do what God's called me to do. And again, I know this conversation is probably taking a lot more life than the generosity conversation, but if I could just bring it there for just a second. Last week, I gave you guys a challenge, right? I said, hey, I want you to go from nothing to something. Anybody remember this? Something to consistent. And if you're consistent in your generosity, I want you to consider going from consistent to extravagant. Right? What's stopping you? I don't know where you are. Maybe you're like, I've never given in my life. I've nothing. Maybe your next step is I'm going to go something. Maybe you're like, I do something here and there, whatever. And God says, I want you to be consistent. And maybe a lot of you in here, and I know you are, you're consistent. And God's saying, I want you to be extravagant. And I didn't say this last week, but again, the elephant in the room for a lot of us is the reason that we don't want to do this. It's because we're just afraid. I'm just like, what's going to happen if I actually do that? What's going to happen if I actually start leaning into this extravagant life that God's calling me to be a part of? Because it's scary. And if that's you this morning, I just want you to know, just in closing, that if you're sitting on that ledge and if you're afraid in generosity or anywhere in your life to take that next step, you've just learned something about yourself. Maybe you've never thought about this way, but think about it. If you are afraid to do what God's called you to do, you just learned something about yourself. You just learned that you are afraid. If you're worried and anxious, you just learned something. You just learned that you are worried and anxious about something that God's calling you to do. And so the question that you ought to ask yourself, you owe it to yourself to say, okay, so what am I going to do with this anxiety? What am I going to do with this fear that I have? And I know it's really, really scary, but I want you to consider the possibility today that maybe God is saying to you, there's no way around it because I want you to go through it. I want you to consider the possibility of God saying, I know you're freaking out right now, but I need to see if you can obey me even though you are afraid. I want you to consider the possibility that God is doing the thing that I used to do with my kids in the pool before they learned how to swim. Any dads do this? You guys remember when you'd go to the pool with your little kids and they would stand at the edge of the pool to jump in, and you guys remember you'd be standing like this? Anybody know that thing? And we're like, jump. And what do they say? Come closer, right? They're like, come closer. And don't tell my kids I do this, but I do the same thing all the time. Like, okay, closer, They're like, come closer. And I'm like, all right, I'm coming closer. They're like, don't move. I'm like, I'm not going to move. Just jump. I'm going to count 3, 2, just come. And I keep doing that. And dads, you know what I'm talking about? And when we do that, dads, we're not doing that because we don't love our kids. We're not doing that because we want to scar our kids forever. We're not doing that because we want our kids to drown. No, we're doing that because I want my kids to know what it's like to do something even though you're afraid. Because I know the reward on the other side of it. I'm doing it because I want them to know that their fear is lying to them. I'm doing it because I want to teach my kids that they can trust me, that if you jump, I'm not going to drop you. If you jump, I'm not going to turn around and go, ha ha, that's hilarious. You're drowning. And we laugh, but that's what the Israelites felt in this moment. That's what a lot of us feel when we're scared. Is we're just like, oh, God's abandoned me. There's no way God's just going to turn around and let me drown. And God's, no, that's not the point. That's not the point. I'm trying to teach you a lesson. I'm trying to teach you that you can trust me. And the only way you'll ever know that you can trust me is to just jump in my arms. And no, you want me to take your fear away, but I'm not going to take it away because I need you to actually make this jump. Will you obey God anyways in spite of your fear? Question for those of us in the room, and I'll end with this, who are followers of Jesus Christ. When was the last time that you did something that God was calling you to do even though you were terrified? When was the last time you're like, man, this scares me. Like, I may need to change my underwear later. This is like, I don't know, but I'm going to jump anyways. If you can't think of the last time that happened, you may want to go back to the drawing board because that's the point. That's the point. Paul says we don't walk by sight, we walk by faith. And your Father is trying to teach you that you can trust Him. So what report are you listening to? Do you remember what God has done? And are you willing to obey even when you are afraid?